this gathering, to me, it's kind of a signature event of the honor and celebration of our Crew 22. I've asked my son Dale to be here to help me remember this stuff because I have some difficulty in this bright light reading my monitor here on the screen. So if you'll bear with me, I'd appreciate it. I'd like to give credits to the folks that are really responsible for making this happen. One is my wife and mother of our 4 children, 10 grandchildren, and 8 great-grandchildren. We were just blessed recently with twins and our oldest daughter's youngest, if I could keep this in the right order. Another person is Dick and Lucille Jensen for finding me on the internet and sending out some letters in the blind, which he hit the bingo, and I had to call him back, or didn't have to call him back, but I did. I had to take a long walk around the neighborhood afterwards. But then Ed Weinberg and Jeannie and Pete Ladisic and Joe, and again Dick and Lucille for their support and encouragement at Charleston, South Carolina, at the reunion of our old bomb group last May. On the airplane coming out of Charleston, I said to Shirley, I said, keep in mind it had been 58 odd years since we'd seen each other. I said to Shirley, you know, we just saw these folks yesterday. Anyway, we came on back to our pretty little town of Bishop and settled in there for a while. That meeting and the gathering there inspired me to make this plaque in honor of our crew. And that's really why we're here today, is to recognize the importance of love and what do you say, respect for each other and respect for our family. There's a couple of other people that I'd like to recognize. One is my son Dale and his wife Jane for taking time off from their very busy schedule in Oregon to be here today. Another person I need to mention is Darlene, who started out in Morgantown, West Virginia, and came to us today by way of Heber, Arizona. Heber is a very metropolitan area. You've got to fight daylight into it. She got here anyway. She is really responsible for the final drawing of this, her computer expertise in the final drawing for this plaque on our computer, our house in Bishop. Darlene is our family historian. She's an amazing lady. She can reach back. She has a recall that you wouldn't believe. You ask her a question on a member of our family, she can, there's 3 volumes about an inch and a half thick. She can pull up the volume, the paragraph, and the sentence that refers to Belle Jane or some other member of our family. She's amazing. I've told her often that, Arlene, if you learn one more thing about our family, I may have to kill you. She just smiles at me and goes on. I'd like to thank Bob Miller, Dave Flowers, May Burtness, Betty in the office there, and all the other staff at the Marchfield Museum Foundation. Great folk. I probably have left some very important people out, but I'm sorry about that. Honor Guard, would you please lower the flag to half staff? I think we can be seated until we read the names which will follow the next part of this presentation. Our odyssey as a crew began at Topeka, Kansas, and on to Wichita, Kansas, where we picked up our airplane. Down to 52nd Street Airport in Miami. And after we were airborne out of Miami, we opened our flight orders and found out at that time that we were assigned to the 15th Airport. We proceeded on down by way of South America to Belém, Brazil, where some enterprising crew members acquired a little rhesus monkey, along with a stalk of bananas for subsistence for him. We left Belém on a rather long flight over the equatorial latitudes, overflying the Ascension Islands into Dakar, Northwest Africa. We arrived at Dakar on a rather blinding dust storm. But we finally located the landing strip and landed and taxied in and tied down for the night. Not too many hours into the flight, it became quite apparent to us that that little monkey had not had very much potty training. He left his calling card at every nook and cranny in that whole airplane. So needless to say, we had a little extra latrine duty at Dakar before we could go on from there. We left Dakar, went to Tunis, and then the Gold Coast, and then on up to the beautiful resort town of Spinazzola, which is in southern Italy near the bigger town of Cernola, which had, I recall, had a pretty good winery there, didn't it? And that's where we spent our tour. And Stephen Ambrose wrote a book about George McGovern and his crew, in which he described the conditions pretty well at our base in Italy. The book is called The Wild Blue. You might want to, it's on videotape and CD as well as in book form. It's written around George McGovern and his crew. But anyway, it has some pretty good facts in it. Some of it I would take exception to. One of the more memorable missions that we had this time was on July 2nd, 1944, on a max effort mission to Budapest, Hungary. The target was the Shell oil refinery there. We did our job. We lit the refinery off pretty well. We took some pretty heavy flak, and we took some very heavy fighter intervention, ME-109. The next 4.5 hours was probably the best example of heroism and call beyond duty that you would find anywhere of the men of Crew 22. We managed to get the airplane back to Foggia, Italy. With Colbert Caballero, our ball gunner, was dead. Pete Ledisic, our tail gunner, was mangled into his turret, couldn't get him out. He lost a leg and a lot of other damage. But we did manage to get the rack and jammer onto the ground at Foggia. She took such a heavy hit by the flak and fighters that she never flew again. I would now like to have Pastor McComas read the article, "The Rack is Back," which was a CBS script of a Bond promotion in the States based on our flight to Budapest. Pastor McComas.
Thank you, Mark. The Rack comes back. Nobody thought the Rack and Jammer would come back. When it was last seen, 25 fighters were roaring in on it, 6 and 8 abreast. In the late afternoon haze of southern Italy, someone heard a roar, a sputtering, and the Rack and Jammer skimmed over the trees, mushed into the runway as a parachute billowed from the waist window. The Rack had come back, on guts alone. One gunner was dead. 4 others were critically wounded, and a 7-foot hole gaped in the waist. The tail turret was riddled and banging on loosely, and the hydraulic system was shot out, leaving no flaps, no brakes, no nothing. The Rack and Jammer, piloted by Lieutenant Martin Luther, 22 of Torona, California, was hit by fighters as it turned away after blasting Budapest, Hungary, with other 15th Air Force 24 B-24 Liberator bombers. Quote, "They came in 6 and 8 abreast," unquote, recalled Lieutenant Luther, drawing nervously on a cigarette. "They poured in on us shooting rockets and machine guns. One rocket hit and burst in our waist and blew a 7-foot hole in the fuselage. Another knocked off the top of the tall turret." Sergeant Peter Ledisic, 19 of Cokesburg, Pennsylvania, tail gunner, was blown out of his turret back into the waist. He already had 1 fighter to his credit, and he knew they were still coming in. instinct and what boxers call a fighting heart were his only weapons. With pain gnawing at his consciousness, Sergeant Ladisic crawled back into his turret and shot down his second ME-109 of the day. German fighters were, quote, coming in from all points of the compass, said Lieutenant Paul T. Vandenberg of Grand Rapids, Michigan, who was the navigator. Lieutenant Luther in the cockpit was battling the almost useless controls. Second Lieutenant V.E. Myers, 21 of Kirkwood, Missouri, co-pilot, was juggling the power to keep the bomber on an even keel. Two 20-millimeter shells from a German fighter exploded in the ball turret, killing the gunner. Rockets and 20-millimeter fire slammed into the waist, knocking out the waist gunners. Tech Sergeant T. Jensen, 19, of Lansing, Michigan, and Tech Sergeant Everett Alexander, 29, of Daniel Boone, Kentucky. Gallant is a trite word in describing Sergeants Jensen and Alexander. Wounded, they were unable to stand to their guns, and so they knelt in their positions and held their gun handles above their heads and fired and prayed. Jensen knocked down one, and Alexander blasted two others out of the sky. They kept firing until their guns quit. Up in the nose, Lieutenant Vandenberg was struggling toward the waist. As he edged along the catwalk in the bomb bay, hydraulic fluid from the shredded line sprayed him. The plane was at 15,000 feet. Lieutenant Vandenberg was without oxygen. He made it to the waist, and after giving preliminary first aid to the two waist gunners, Lieutenant Vandenberg started for the tail to the aid of Sergeant Ladisic. To walk past the 7-foot hole, quote, was asking for it, unquote. So he grasped the beam at the top of the plane, and he went hand over hand to the tail to give the gunner first aid. The gallant bomber was still deep in enemy territory, and Lieutenant Vandenberg was needed back in the nose to navigate back home to the home base. Lieutenant K.M. Bloomfield, 24 of Jonesburg, Louisiana, Bombardier, and Lieutenant Luther were already heading to the waist to help. Sergeant W.O. Clark, top gunner, was knocked out of his turret by 20-millimeter fire. He was uninjured, but unconscious. Lieutenant Luther revived him, and Sergeant Clark climbed back into his position and knocked down another enemy plane. By this time, all the bomber's guns were useless. It couldn't be long now before the fighters would come in for the kill. But strangely enough, they didn't. They ran out of ammunition. Lieutenant Myers was now flying the bomber with Lieutenant Luther in the waist, and Lieutenant Bloomfield administering first aid. Quote, "We made bandages out of anything we could find that was clean," unquote, said Lieutenant Bloomfield. And these fellows never said a word. With the fighters dispersed, there still remained the problem of getting the rack and jammer back. Quote, "Lieutenant Vandenberg brought us back," unquote, said Lieutenant Bloomfield. All he had to work with was a map and his index finger. He led us out of the flak areas by the shortest route possible. He really did a grand job. Lieutenant Luther returned to the cockpit. As the limping bomber neared the Allied base in Italy, the landing gear cranked down. Quote, waist to pilot, unquote, called Lieutenant Bloomberg. "There's a hole as big as your fist in the right tire." With these odds against them, they had to bring the rack and jammer in. When the bomber was 10 feet from the runway, it gave a lurch to the right. The right wing dropped, and Lieutenant Bloomfield tied a parachute to the left waist gun mount and pulled the ripcord. The bomber rumbled to a halt. The rack had come back.
Thank you, Pastor. I'd like now to read the names of our crew members. Albert Cavallero, ball gunner, killed in action July 2nd, 1944. Everett Alexander, radio operator, waist gunner. Pete Clark, second engineer, top gunner. Bernice Myers, co-pilot. Paul Vandenberg, navigator. And as a member of our original crew, John J. Smith, bombardier. On this mission, it was Lieutenant Bloomberg. Then there's those of us that are survived this, thanks to a great part to those that have gone on ahead of us. And that's Dick Jensen, Richard T., and his wife Lucille, who are here today. Ed Weinberg and his wife, Jeannie. Pete Ledisick. And myself and my wife, Shirley. We would please stand and we'll ask Bob Barrett and echo by Stan Smith to sound tap. Please be seated. There are a lot of stories that could be and were written about members of our crew and their accidents. But there's one that kind of stuck in my mind all these years, and that was a story about our navigator, Paul Vandenberg, and his use of material from a parachute that we described on the rack as back. I'd ask Pastor McComas to read that article, if you would. Thank you.
The article is titled Baptism Gown Saved Aviator. Infant Krista Thorpe will be baptized Sunday in an embroidered nylon gown made from a parachute which helped to land her great-uncle's shot-riddled bomber in Italy nearly 38 years ago. The daughter of Wes and Gladys Thorpe will become the 20th in a family line to wear the heirloom gown for baptism. The story began over Budapest, Hungary on July 2nd, 1944, when German Messerschmitt fighters blazed gunfire into a B-24 Liberator bomber navigated by First Lieutenant Paul Vandenberg of Grand Rapids. The U.S. bomber was one of several returning from a daytime raid over Nazi-held territory. Two of the wounded American crewmen couldn't stand, but held machine gun handles above their heads and fired at the attacking fighters, said Vandenberg, now 61, a private engineer who lives in Okemos. The duel continued until the German pursuers apparently ran out of ammunition, recalled Vandenberg. The bomber limped across the Adriatic Sea with a gaping hole in its belly, damaged flight controls, a dead tail gunner, and several wounded crewmen. Vandenberg was sprayed with hydraulic fluid from shot-up tubing as he maneuvered his way, hand over hand, along a ceiling bar in the fuselage to aid the wounded. Knowing that the hydraulic wheel brakes were out, Vandenberg and crewman Richard T. Jensen from Lansing improvised 2 parachutes to brake the plane as it landed in an airfield at Foggia, southern Italy. Chute dragging wasn't part of the standard emergency tricks at the time. We heard of some others doing it, Vandenberg did recall. The 2 men anchored 1 parachute each on the top waist gun mounts, pulled the ripcords and let the chutes billow out the side windows moments before touchdown. The plane overshot the runway, but it didn't crash. Later, the chutes were cut up for souvenirs. Vandenberg brought his segment home to his wife, Florence, who passed it on to her sister, Emma Ann List of Bay City, who is Westhorpe's aunt. She used some of the chute material to make a blouse for Florence Vandenberg and turned the rest into a long christening gown for her son. Parachute cord threads were used for the fancy embroidery. Thomas Edward List wore the gown for his baptism on September 2nd, 1945. The following year, infant Wes Thorpe of Bay City, now manager of Michigan House Press Room, became the 3rd infant to be christened in the gown. Krista Thorpe's turn will be at 10:30 Sunday at Lansing's Martin Luther Chapel. That, coincidentally, is an appropriate site. You see, the pilot of Vandenberg's bomber was a 22-year-old Californian named Martin Luther.
Thank you, Pastor. I was remiss in not honoring or giving credits to our honor guard. It's an ROTC group that's been so kind as to be here today. Please raise the flag back to full staff. My father was, I guess you could describe him as somewhat of a romantic. He liked poetry. Matter of fact, he wrote some poetry for his own enjoyment. One of his favorite poems was by Rudyard Kipling, entitled If. This poem was read at his funeral many years ago back in Tennessee. I'd like to ask Pastor McComas to read this poem for us today. Thank you.
We have something in common, Martin. It's my father's favorite poem. And I remember he had it framed for me, and it stayed in my bedroom all during the years that I was growing up. If, by Rudyard Kipling. If you can keep your head, and all about you are losing theirs, blaming it on you. If you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too. If you can wait and not be tired by waiting, or being lied about, don't deal in lies. Or being hated, don't give way to hating. And yet, don't look too good, nor talk too wise. If you can dream, and not make dreams your master. If you can think and not make thoughts your aim. If you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those 2 impostors the same. If you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken, twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, or watch the things you gave your life to broken, and stoop and build them up with worn-out tools. If you can make one heap of all your winnings and risk it on one turn of pitch and toss, and lose and start again at your beginnings, and never breathe a word about your loss, if you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone, and so hold on when there's nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings, or lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men can count with you, but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it. And which is more, you'll be a man, my son.
Thank you, Pastor. I'd like now to ask you to listen to a rendition by John Wayne the Duke entitled America, Why I Love It.
You've seen a Kansas sunset or an Arizona rain? Have you drifted on a bayou down Louisiana way? You watched the cold fog drifting over San Francisco Bay? Have you heard a bobwhite calling in the Carolina pines, or heard the bellow of a diesel in the Appalachia mines? Does the call of the Niagara thrill you when you hear her waters roar? Massachusetts shore, where men who braved a hardened world first stepped on Plymouth Rock. Do you think of them when you stroll along a New York City dock? Have you seen a snowflake drifting in the Rockies way up high? Have you seen the sun come blazing down from a bright Nevada sky? You hailed to the Columbia as you rushed into the sea, or how you're headed Gettysburg?